Music.
Hello and good evening, good early evening, good late evening to everybody. We were going to have a poll, and I have, of course, neglected to build the second poll, but we will do that in a minute. While everybody is coming in this evening, I'll just remind you and welcome you to the IT Masters Digital Directors Demystifying Directorship webinar for this evening. It would be interesting if you would like to say hello in the chat, and I'd be particularly interested to know if you're East Coast or West Coast tonight, whether you're a night owl or whether you took advantage of the first time that we've actually run a 10 p.m. Sydney time webinar, 7 p.m. Perth time webinar. It's interesting to know for the future use as to how good a time that is for people. We always assume early evening is best. Maybe it's not always best as well for people on the East Coast as well as Western Australians. But yes, we will just wait about 5 or 6, oh, not even 5 or 6 minutes, probably 1 or 2 more minutes, and we will start kicking into it. My name's Shane Murphy. I'm the current CEO at IT Masters. Our long-term CEO just recently departed, and I'm filling in for a while. And I will introduce you to our guest speaker in a minute, or I should say guest speaker, actually originator of this webinar series. And yes, somebody in Tasmania, which is good to see. And lovely to see everybody coming in and saying hello in the chat. By the way, if you've got questions for Ben as the night goes on, please put them in the Q&A. It's a little bit easier to separate out from the chat. And nice to see you here too, Amber. I'm glad you got the invite that we just resent to you. Having said all that, I should probably launch straight into our introduction. I will put a poll up in a couple of minutes just to hear what people have got to think about stuff. So Ben McEvoy came to speak to me a little while ago and said, look, I'm interested in doing this thing about digital directorship. What do you think? And I said, this sounds great. We know we've got lots of people in our IT Masters database who have been doing their stuff for years, want to know what the next thing for them in their career is. A lot of them have got masters by now. They're CISOs, CIOs, C-suite type people, and maybe they want to go down the director's path. And maybe there's something there for us in the future as well. So Ben's somebody who's an experienced board director and an IT Masters graduate. He's got more than 25 years experience in leadership roles, and he's built systems in the UK, Canada, and Australia, and particularly in the health area. Today, his software is used by 50% of Australian GPs, 65% of UK GPs, and it delivers 10% of Australia's imaging results, 35% of our pathology results, and in 80% of Australia's clinical trial sites and in every ambulance in WA. The software that he built to support research into cardiovascular disease in the UK has contributed to the million years of additional human lives that the research has saved since 2007. And I think Ben will refer to that later on this evening. He cares deeply about digital ethics and the impact technology has on people, as do we all, actually. He founded Digital Directors in 2025 to champion the cause of digital governance excellence in Australia's boardrooms and governing bodies. And in short, he believes that we need more people like you leading Australia into the digital age and looking after our organisations. Thanks, Ben. How are you again this evening for version 2?
Thanks, Shane. I feel like I need to trim that bio down a little bit. It's always embarrassing to sit and listen to somebody reading it back to you. So I appreciate that. And as I mentioned to you, the one thing that isn't on my bio is I'm also an internationally accredited commercial yacht master. So I'm a sailing fan. And so there's a little bit of a boat theme that you'll sense in the presentation tonight.
Excellent. Yes.
So it looks like, should we just get started, Shane? Shall we kick it off?
Absolutely. Let's go.
Fantastic. Let's go. All right. So good evening, everybody. Welcome to Demystifying Directorship. So as Shane said, founded Digital Directors last year with the idea of driving more or supporting more digital executives in particular into directorship, which is stepping up into the boardrooms of Australian organisations. In in the course of my career, I've been asked a lot of questions. People reach out to me and say, what's involved in directorship? What even is it? I don't really understand what directors do. I don't understand whether I would have a place in that as a digital executive. How do I even make my way on to the board? What's involved practically? And how would I even get started? So tonight's session is really to answer a lot of those questions and also give you an opportunity to ask other questions along the way. So the three things I'm going to address is what is directorship? Why do directors exist? Why are digital executives in particular might want to consider directorship and why now in particular? And then finally, a bit of practical guidance on how to get started or to progress if you've already started. So let's go. So what is a director? Oh, that's changed. A slide problem. Well, okay. So the AICD have a definition of what a director is, but I am allergic to reading slides out to people. So instead, I'm going to just talk about boats. So the idea of directorship really began in the period between the 15th and the 17th century, which is known as the Age of Discovery or the Age of European Exploration. We're thinking Columbus and Vasco da Gama, Magellan, where previously isolated parts of the world became connected and empires were built, and people were seeing a lot of opportunity to get rich by trading across the globe. But the problem was voyages by ship are very long, they're very risky, and they're very expensive. And generally, only sort of royalty and large governments had the cash and the risk appetite to fund them. Around about 1602, the Dutch East India Company invented a new approach to this problem of very risky, very expensive ventures. And they created what was the very first organization that was a shared stockholding organization. Prior to that, they didn't exist. So they would sell stock to any citizen of the Dutch Republic, and that would let them fund journeys that they wouldn't be able to otherwise. More people could share in the benefits of success, and they could also diversify the risk if something went wrong. But this created a new problem. Previously, the funder of a journey could hold a ship's captain directly accountable for their performance if something went wrong personally. But how do you hold a captain accountable if you have thousands of individual shareholders, all of whom have just a very small amount of money in the organization? So the answer to that was they created a court of directors. And the Dutch East India Company didn't call it a court of directors. They had a Dutch phrase for it, which translates roughly as the gentleman's 17. There were 17 elected officials, essentially, that were accountable to the shareholders, and they were the ones who directed the voyages underneath the Dutch East India Company. And that's kind of the foundation of directorship, a representative body of people who are acting in the best interests of the shareholders, and they are directing the activities of the organization. Now, these are people who were well connected, had access to a lot of information, they had very broad relationships, and they would decide on the number of ships, the types of cargo, the ports they would visit, and they would pick the captains who were running those voyages, and the captain would then operate the ship and make decisions as issues arose, and they'd often be away for months or years at a time. It worked so well that basically every other country copied the idea, including the UK, and the Dutch East India Company lasted for a good couple of hundred years. So fast forward to 1767. The transit of Venus. Venus is scheduled to transit the sun in 1769. Now, this is a rare event that offered a chance for improving celestial navigation by measuring the exact distance to the sun. And for a lot of very complicated reasons, that would help fleets navigate the Earth. So it was very important. But the best vantage point was in Tahiti. And if they missed it, the next transit of Venus was 105 years later. So lots at stake, very complicated, very long way to go. So the British Royal Society and a chap called Joseph Banks, who you may have heard of, decided to put together a voyage. So Banks took ownership of determining the scope and breadth of the mission. So he decided on where they would go, what kind of science would be conducted along the way, as well as making sure that they had the equipment to measure the transit of Venus. And then he went and secured funding. He secured funding from the king, from other Royal Society members, and he personally contributed funds himself. So that's one of the functions of directorship, was defining the scope of what the organization would do, and then also finding the funding that was appropriate to deliver on that scope. The second thing that the Royal Society and Banks did was they issued a set of what they called hints. And this was guidance towards culture of how they wanted the people who went on this voyage to behave towards Indigenous peoples. They emphasized patience, they emphasized consent, they emphasized that conquest gave no rights over land, and they really wanted to push a scientific governance culture. So they issued that cultural directive to the captain. Now, the captain they picked was Cook, and we all know about James Cook. He received the funding, he received the scope, he understood the goals, he took on board the culture, and then he selected the ships and the teams and the crew and the equipment that they would take with them, knowing that he would be judged on his compliance with the requirements, his seamanship, and the results of the voyage. So here's the distinction between, you can see the distinction between directorship, which is setting those goals, setting the mission, and defining the broad guidelines. And then Cook as the captain, he's the equivalent of a CEO today. He's the head of the executive function. So he's the person actually charged with executing on the voyage or the mission. So interestingly, on that voyage, Banks obviously was a passenger on the Endeavour as well. And it's an interesting interplay between somebody who has a director role when he's looking for funding and so on, and then he was a passenger on the vessel. And there are documented cases in diaries of both men where they clashed over usually Banks wanting to do more science and Cook saying, no, in order to keep the boat safe, we have weather coming, or there's some other reason, we need to get going sooner. And they kind of clashed over those details. But Banks was always very clear that Cook retained undisputed command of the ship. So when he was on board, he thought of himself as a citizen and a passenger, and Cook was in command. And that's the same with the CEO today. The CEO would have complete authority over the execution within the organization, even if it's a director that's being involved. And so Cook decided on routes and timing and the discipline and responses to danger and conflict and so on. So they were very successful. They measured the transit in Tahiti, and then Cook opened, at the time, it was a sealed envelope with secret instructions in it. And those were the instructions that told him, once you've been to Tahiti and you've measured the transit, head west and go searching for Terra Australis Incognita, the unknown Great Southern Land. And that's what brought him to the east coast of Australia, where they discovered Botany Bay, which he named after Banks, actually, and then on home several months later. So when they arrived back home, Banks collected data that Cook had recorded during the voyage, his logbooks and observations and so on, and he combined that information with his own, and it was he who proposed to the Royal Society and also to the King and the Parliament that Botany Bay would be the most eligible site for a convict settlement, and he argued that New Holland's land offered an advantageous return. So here, Banks is in the role of a director. He is determining a new strategy based on the execution and success of the previous strategy. And we see that today. You will hear about organizations talking about a 3 to 5 year strategy, and then they refresh that strategy once that 3 to 5 year period has been complete. And so here you see that playing out in real time with Banks. He's executed on one strategy. The vision was to improve navigation for the entirety of the British fleet, which he did by using this Venus observation. And then he returned home and he said, right, well, based on what I've learned, I've got a new strategy. So he set the strategy, and then he also continued to drive the funding and the scoping of those future voyages. Cook had 2 more voyages after that. Here in each case, the distinction is that Banks is setting the goals, he's setting the vision, he's setting the mission, and he's setting some cultural and risk appetite, but it's Cook. He provides input to these areas, but his focus is on day-to-day execution. So directors today continue to have that divide. If we fast forward to modern directorship, these directors still occupy that same space between those who own the enterprise, so the funders, and those who are executing on delivering on it. And you'll hear the phrase noses in, fingers out. Some people just say NIFO. Directors are interested in understanding what's going on in the organization, and they should be aware of it, but they're not tempted to directly interfere and get their fingers into the details. And that's the distinction that directors make. So the responsibilities have expanded, of course, from kings and nobles to now members and shareholders. So HBF, for example, is a membership organization. The directors of HBF are accountable to the over 1 million members of HBF. BHP has perhaps 2 million shareholders, and the board of BHP are accountable to those shareholders. The responsibility of directors was also expanded a little more in that today we think of directorship as also being accountable to stakeholders, and stakeholders takes in a range of others, whether they're customers, the environment that they're operating in, the legislation and regulations of national and state and local government. So directors have accountability to a far broader range of individuals and organizations than they did several hundred years ago. In fact, by some counts, today there are about 108 individual pieces of legislation in Australia which convey some form of accountability onto a director. So that's the history and background and broadly where directors sit in the organizational landscape. But what do they actually do from a practical sense? Well, there's 4 key elements. The first I've already touched on, which is accountability. So directors take personal accountability and along with the authority to lead the organization. So they have important duties to the organization, and you can kind of think of them as, I don't like to say one throat to choke anymore, we say one hand to shake. So they are accountable ultimately for the success of the organization. They're required to act in good faith and the best interests of the organization. That's a fiduciary duty, with care and diligence. The days of just not turning up to meetings are long gone. And there was a finding in the Star Entertainment case recently, which commented on the requirement for directors to be attentive to the business and not just receiving papers and blowing past them, essentially. They have to act for a proper purpose, so they don't misuse their position or the information that they receive. They avoid conflicts of interest, and the big one is preventing insolvent trading. So that's the key accountability section of directorship. They do a lot of learning. So directors are expected to maintain a breadth of knowledge about their own organization, about their competitors, trends, regulations, compliance, macroeconomic trends, their staff, customers, community, and they should be thinking in different horizons, today, tomorrow, 10 years from now. And most importantly, they should draw from the organization via board papers information that is relevant to the ongoing operation of the organization. So it's a core function that directors stay informed about the organization as well as the environment that it's operating in. The third is collaboration. So meeting, conversing, networking, connecting with funders, decision makers in the community, regulators, customers, stakeholders. Directors are required to maintain a lot of relationships with a lot of different stakeholders as part of their function in the organization. Most important form of collaboration, though, is board meetings. So each director has individual accountabilities, but the board makes decisions as a collective. So each director must be adept at presenting thoughts, raising questions and objections, discussing different perspectives on the matters before the board, and then listening and understanding each other, and then arriving at a common position that the board then takes formally. So that ability to collaborate effectively with your stakeholders and other board members is crucial. The last item here is thinking, but thinking at a different level. So we're talking about bridging the gap between corporate governance and the operational execution within the business. So, for example, I've implemented ISO standards across a number of enterprises that I've been involved in as an executive. And to me, those standards always felt like this is the way we are going to do things because it's a good and disciplined way to, for example, be compliant with ISO 27001. And we know that now our systems are compliant and they're safe, and we measure up to a certain standard of security. But from a board level, it's not the executed functionality of that standard which is important. They're thinking about the regulatory requirements on the organization. So the Corporations Act says they must ensure, for financial services organizations, for example, says you must ensure that the financial services covered by the license are provided efficiently, honestly, fairly, having adequate resources, competence, and risk management systems in place. Now, that's a pretty broad definition. How does a director know that, what does efficiently mean? Right? That's a word that can mean a lot of different things. Adequate resources. Well, how do we know it's adequate? And that's where the director's judgment comes in, because different sizes of organizations, different complexities of organizations will answer that question differently. But what ISO does for the director is it lets them have a recognized standard that's been implemented that they can answer that question with. So if a regulator comes and says, well, did you have adequate risk management systems in place? I can point to my compliant ISO 27001 implementation and say, yes, I did, and here's evidence that I did. I took the action to implement that, and then I audited it, checked it, and make sure it was operating correctly. And that's how I discharge my duty under the Act, to be to have adequate resources and controls in place. So that's kind of what directors do. Now, what's the time commitment for directorship? So you can kind of think that the time commitment of directorship, certainly early directors, which is this audience here, as having a kind of fairly time-consuming hobby. Like for me, it's sailing. This is me in the boat on the right here called Fusion. It's not my favorite photo because we are actually at the back of the fleet here. Normally we're at the front of the fleet. But on this day, a couple of people managed to get in front of us. So for me, this is a weekend hobby, and it's most of my Saturday. If I go down, you're down there at midday, and we're done and off the boat by maybe 6 o'clock. So it's sort of 6 hours on a Saturday. So for board entry-level roles, you can expect between 6 and 12 meetings a year. So many boards meet every month, some every 2 months, some quarterly. You can expect between 1 and 3 hours per meeting, but that goes up to full days in some cases in larger organizations. So that's just the meeting. But on top of that, there's pre-reading. So you will receive a board pack usually a week before the meeting, and a board pack can be 150 to 250 pages of reading. That's a lot of reading to do that most people aren't used to doing. You can think of that, that's about a third of Moby Dick. It's almost a full Harry Potter book, or since nobody reads books anymore, it's about 1,000 tweets. So it's about 2 to 4 hours of reading before you get to the meeting. In fact, the gold standard guidance is you should read the board papers 3 times before you attend the meeting to make sure you've understood it in depth. On top of that, occasional additional meetings for things like strategy workshops or perhaps risk work sessions, things like that. If you have some actions that you take away from the meeting, you've got to commit time to completing those. And then there's maintaining your awareness of governance that's relevant to your organization. So being aware of regulation changes. And in some cases, you get that passively from your executive roles, but some cases you need to make sure that you're across those. And then maintaining and growing your network as well. So connecting with people in the industry or that may be valuable to furthering the causes of the organization. So you can think of it as more time commitment in a given year than being a dedicated AFL fan, but it's less time than you need to start a side hustle tech job at a startup. The last thing to note is that board roles generally, you will be asked to make a multi-year commitment, usually 2 or 3 years. It's called a term, and then you will often be able to renew that for a number of terms, so maybe 2 or 3 terms. And then often a board will have a regulation that says once you've reached that maximum term limit, you're not eligible to be a director anymore because it is good governance to turn over the board and keep keep the directors on the board fresh. So you may get limited to 3 times 3 terms. That's pretty common. All right. So, and what do directorships pay? I get asked this a lot as well. To start out, often your first directorship may be a volunteer role in a not-for-profit. You may get your expenses reimbursed, but about 60% of not-for-profit boards are unpaid, although that is slowly changing at the moment due to the need to have more skilled representatives come into not-for-profit boards. An entry-level salary for your first paid board role might be $10,000 or $20,000, depending on the time, commitment, the turnover of the organization, your skills and experience. Once you move fully into directorship, the average director role is $61,000, I think is the national average in Australia. If you look at industry background, non-executive directors with tech backgrounds are actually the highest paid of any industry, which is 85,000 on average. And if you're a chair with a tech background, your second or third highest of the industries at about 100,000 is the average. On top of all of that, obviously, if you're in a not-for-profit or even in a corporate, you get to help your community, you're learning new skills, you get exposed to new types of problems, you gain a broader perspective on how organizations operate. It's a good career for advancement as well. Directorship is a mark of seniority and trust. And you get a chance to make new connections in a new function as well. So those are all the benefits of directorship. Maybe I'll pause and see if there are any questions about any of that.
No questions at the moment, actually. So I think you can probably keep on going. I've just actually asked if people would like to pop some questions in as we go along.
We'll pause if we get any come up. All right, push through. Lovely. Okay, so the Digital Director Challenge. So we are at a particular moment in time. And the reason why I started Digital Directors last year is I think we're at a turning point where it is important that we get people with digital skills onto boards in Australia. And I'm going to tell you why. Here's the headline. So the number of directors who respond to a survey by the University of New South Wales recently, who said they have any technical competence at all, was about 16% of directors, 1 in 6. Depending on which survey you look at, somewhere between 4 and 7% of directors say that they have technical background or deep tech expertise, between 4 and 7%, and less than 1% have any cybersecurity experience. So you compare that to the USA, where boards are considered to have a phrase digitally savvy. It's an MIT classification. But they're considered digitally savvy if they have 3 directors with deep technology expertise on them. So that's the US benchmark. In 2019, when the MIT study was done originally, it showed that digitally savvy boards outperformed their peers by about 30% on a range of metrics, and about 24% of US boards met that criteria at the time. Fast forward 7 years, 6, 7 years, and last year it went from 24% of boards meeting that criteria in the US to 72. So there are more digital directors in US boards now. And last year, 16% of all new directors had a tech background. And for those under 50, it was 33% in the US that had a tech background. So why is that different, so different to what it is in Australia? Well, here's some of the key challenges. First of all, technology people don't swim in the same pond as the incumbent orthodoxy of directors in Australia. You're thinking accountants, lawyers, and managers, they make up about 80 to 85% of directors today in Australian boards. Many tech execs don't even consider directorship as a career option. And those that do maybe go and do the AICD course, and then they think, what now? And so because they're not at the same lunches and in the same conferences and rubbing elbows with those who are already directors, they find it very difficult to move forward with pursuit of directorship. Now, the hope here is, the little light of hope here is that yes, while 65% or so of board role opportunities do come through personal connections, and about 80% of board roles are never advertised. Of those, about 50% go actually to acquaintances rather than close friends. So you don't need to have been friends with someone since high school to get a board role anymore. Actually, what you just need to do is to have an acquaintance relationship with somebody who's recognized the value you can bring to their organization. And when that role comes up, they'll reach out to you and give you the opportunity. So what they call weak links are effective in finding board roles. The second challenge we have is George W. Bush in 2000 coined a phrase, the soft bigotry of low expectations. And he was using it to describe a soft kind of prejudice where people assume that someone is incapable of a certain high achievement because of their background. And we find a little bit of this in Australian executive search and other directorship circles. I was speaking to I won't say who it was, but I was speaking to an executive search firm recently, and I said, gee, it's disappointing that we don't see more digital directors being moved onto boards. And the response was, oh, I just had a board that needed somebody with deep digital skills. And I found an accountant that had experienced a cyber incident. And so because she'd experienced a cyber incident, she was the perfect person to go and sit on that board that needed digital exposure, needed technology skills. And I said, gee, why didn't you think about finding somebody with deep technical experience? And the response was, technology people are really only good at one thing. They're really only good at technology. And so this is this soft prejudice of low expectations, right? This recruiter has pigeonholed their expectation of technology executives as being limited in breadth. So we have to broaden our horizons. Accountants did it. The CPA and the CA did a lot of advocacy for accountants being business partners rather than just bookkeepers. And today, accountants are thought of as partners in the business. They're 2IC to the CEO, and they're thought of as they used to be massive nerds, right? Now they're thought of as being part of the business firm. And so we need to do the same thing. We have a reputational change that we need to affect in the perception of those who are inviting people into boardrooms. So we need to get more involved in strategy, more involved in risk, in finance and legal, and higher level governance aspects of the organizations that we work. The third is we can just call it out directly as communication, right? So we have to learn to communicate at the right level. I tell the joke, how do you know when you've got a techie who's an extrovert, well, he looks at your shoes when he's talking to you rather than looking at his own. Now, there's a reason that stereotype exists. And we're famous for using a lot of jargon, a lot of three-letter acronyms, right? The reason I've got this, the brief history of time up on the screen is very famously when Stephen Hawking was writing this book, his publisher came to him and said, after an initial edit, he said, Stephen, every equation you have in this book will halve the readership. You have to take these equations out, right? This kind of technical jargon ostracizes the public. And so Hawkins very famously agreed, and he took every equation out of the book except one, E equals mc squared, and he said, "I'm willing to pay half the readership to have E equals mc squared in the book." And if you've ever encountered yourself implementing a solution that you know is not the best idea, but someone in authority has told you to do it because they saw it at a trade show, or a sales rep from the vendor convinced them, you know what I'm talking about, right? Somebody else was more convincing than you in getting the decision maker to make a choice. Or the opposite, you find yourself implementing a solution that you know is better in spite of the request of that authority, what I call making course corrections from the engine room. Again, it's a failure of being able to communicate and convince those authorities of what the best solution is. So we have to learn to tell stories. We have to remove technical jargon from our language and elevate our communications to a governance level. And this is the big one. The current average Australian director is a white male accountant, and he's 61 years old. So that means that the nominations committee and the hiring committees who hire new directors are also white, male, 61-year-old accountants. So we're combating a self-perpetuating orthodoxy which reaches back to Joseph Banks and beyond. But there's hope. So Women on Boards was founded in 2006 in Australia. And since they began reporting in 2009, the women's representation on boards has doubled. The targets for women on Australian government boards overall are being exceeded. Women hold 54% of the positions as of last year, and 90% of boards now have more than 40% women on them. So that is an incredible change in a short period of time, advocating for women on boards. And in that same period, cultural diversity representation on boards has also doubled. So that's the male and white elements moving in the right direction. Now, we are going to be targeting the accountant part of the orthodoxy. So the diversity of background is where we will be coming up against that orthodoxy of accountants, lawyers, and managers make up 85%. And I suspect if we're successful, we may give that age piece a nudge as well. Tech moves pretty fast, and there's no doubt that each generation brings with it new and deeper understandings of the technology of the day. I still remember having to remember people's phone numbers and drawing mud maps on bits of paper to get to your friend's house because we didn't have mobile phones and we didn't have GPS. Joe Longo, who was the ASIC chair, he recently bemoaned that despite there being lip service to the importance of diversity of background on boards, we've seen it move materially for women, and we've seen it move materially for cultural background. We haven't seen it move for diversity of industry background. And he said the number of tech directors on boards has barely moved over the last few years, despite efforts by the AICD and the federal government. So it's a call to arms for digital executives to make a move into directorship. But why and why now? Well, Australia needs our way of thinking. So I'll quote Joe Longo again, the ASIC chair. He said at the Governance Forum in Sydney a couple of weeks ago, he said, Australia is falling to the back of the pack in the global race for innovation. The Productivity Commission report shows that Australia's productivity growth has dropped by more than 80% since I was born. It's currently at the lowest it has been in 60 years. Australia's economy is sometimes called a pit and a farm. Mining and agriculture make up about 70% of our exports and about 33% of our GDP. The Productivity Commission report says Australia has become less good at adopting and adapting technologies, and Australian firms have increasingly fallen behind the global productivity frontier. A result of those trends, productivity growth is well below the average for the 90s and 2000s. It's just getting worse. So what do they say is the solution? Well, recent developments in areas like AI could well turn this around if Australia is able to harness the benefits. Hugely important in the long run is a correlation of growth and new ideas, which are the feedstock of growth. So new ideas get embedded in investments, and investments are driven by directors and boards into new technologies, education, new ideas, which then get embedded into the cumulative knowledge of how the economy works. If you pull up the Productivity Commission's report and you search for the word technology, it lights up like a Christmas tree. It is everywhere in their recommendations. And so we need this way of thinking, our way of thinking, and technology expertise and deep experience in our boardrooms to address this productivity issue. The example that I use, and Shane referred to a little bit earlier, when I was working for a British health organisation, one of the projects we were involved in was research into cardiovascular disease. And we contributed some technology and we built some software to assist researchers who were looking at how cardiovascular disease was detected and how it was treated. And those researchers used that tech and they made some recommendations which were adopted by the UK health system. And then rolled out to detect and treat people with cardiovascular disease, which at the time was the #1 cause of death in the UK. That was released in 2007. They did a retrospective on it in 2022, and about 135,000 people had been impacted with a net saving of about 1 million years of human life. Now, that came up in a conversation I had with a director on a mental health board that I serve on. We were talking about innovation in service delivery, and her perspective was to innovate in service delivery, we could have different professionals in the room at different times, we could collaborate in different ways to move people through the process. She was thinking from a very practical sense. And I told her, why don't we go and get the data and look at how we've done detection and look at how we've done treatment, and we may be able to innovate our service delivery in that way. And she looked at me, she said, I would never, ever have even thought about our data as being an asset that we could go and use in that way. And I would never have thought of the way that she was approaching that innovation. So that's the importance of having different perspectives on the same problem in the same room, in the boardroom, to help to drive genuinely different ways of looking at innovation. And of course, businesses today are unavoidably tech driven. Tech is in everything that every organization does, just about. In 1975, an analysis of the S&P 500 was done, and intangible assets, which is goodwill, but also data and systems, your tech, was about 17% of the value of the S&P 500. The rest was physical assets, property, a plant, et cetera, et cetera. Today, that number is 92%. So 92% of the value of the S&P 500 is intangible assets. These are digital assets, systems, data, networks, right? If you ask your CFO about control over money, physical assets, etc., they would have a long list of policies and processes and so on. Digital assets go unmined and underutilized, particularly in Australia at the moment. And so we need directors who are confident and comfortable with using those assets and applying them effectively in their organizations. We just need more of that thinking. Our headlines and news feeds are awash with systems outages, data breaches, digital governance challenges, AI, quantum computing. The number one threat, if you ask boards what the number one threat to their organization is, they say digital disruption, whether that's international disruption, disruption from competition, or even internally. The number one risk is cybersecurity and data protection. And the number one opportunity they report is AI adoption and transformation. Every single one of those is right in the heart of requiring tech capability to execute on. Joe Longo, let's quote him for a third time. He said, "There isn't a single material issue facing our institutions that doesn't require data, systems, technology, and processes to effectively address." And last year, 43% of boards added ICT to their skills matrix. So we're at a pivot point, and we need to bridge the gap. So there has never been a greater call to arms than Australia's current economic and productivity climate. Tech has never been more important to organisations, and our capabilities have never been more important to the boardroom. So this is a moment that brings these factors together and gives us the opportunity to challenge the orthodoxy of what a director is. And to bridge that gap between the few digital directors that are in Australian boardrooms today, that 3, 4, 5%, and a new orthodoxy where every board member must be at least digitally competent and every boardroom must have some deep digital expertise in it. That's the new orthodoxy we're striving for. So how would you get started if you're interested? Well, the first thing is it's a commitment. So directorship is not like finding a new job. You don't put together a CV and go on to Seek and send it and do some interviews and you're in a new role. It is a long road, and so you have to be ready to commit over a long term to directorship. A board profile is not a CV. So experience and outcome is great for jobs. But boards are interested in your insights, your strategic thinking, your collaboration style, and your exposure to corporate governance issues. And that's far more important for boards than I executed on Project X. Personal development is a key foundational element for directorship. Continuous learning is expected. Many, particularly digital executives, would benefit from specific coaching to address some of the items I talked about earlier, communication being one of them, lifting our communication into a board level. And mentoring is so valuable. If you can find a mentor who has experience of being on a board and they can share with you their experience, that's really, really valuable, and it helps you prepare for directorship. So that's development. Positioning. So I hear in speaking to a number of the members who've joined Digital Directors since we launched, they say, yes, I'm a digital executive. I went and did the AICD course, and I've signed up to the AICD mailing list for new director roles. I send my CV and I never hear anything back. It's just like sending things into a black hole. I said yes, because positioning is so important, right? Your value proposition as a director and what makes you uniquely valuable to that organization at that moment isn't something that you can do with a CV and a copy and paste. People talk about a cover letter, but really, when I have submitted board profiles in the past, I custom write it almost from scratch for every role that I go to apply for, because it needs to exactly match that moment in that organization's life cycle. Go and read any public information they've published. What are their current projects? Who is the current board? What are their skill sets? Where are the gaps in that board? You need to be very specific about positioning and positioning your strengths. So it's crucial to find your positioning and to position it well. And the last piece is deliberate networking. So again, partially because we don't just naturally rub shoulders with those who are making the hiring decisions at board level. Deliberate networking is even more important for us than it is perhaps for other aspiring directors. You have to select carefully the events that you're going to attend, the people that you want to approach, how you're going to engage with them, and how you create that kind of next step link. Hey, let's catch up for a coffee in a couple of weeks to maintain that relationship. That's just an ongoing piece of work that you need to do if you're pursuing directorship. So a lot of people, when they are thinking, where do I start? One of the best ways to approach it is to find a not-for-profit cause that you care about, to prepare a profile just for them, and then to go and find a personal introduction to somebody on the board and have a conversation with them and approach deliberately and pitch your value to them. That's a good start. I should say with all of these pieces, digital directors can help. We can help with preparing profiles, connecting you with people who can support you with that. Personal development, we have trainers, we have mentors, we have coaches available, and we run networking pods as well, where we can come and network together so that you're supported by a couple of other people who can give you encouragement, and you don't feel like you're out there doing it by yourself. I know, Shane, you said previously that networking is one of the things that often technical people find the most challenging, right?
I think it's interesting, and having come, I don't even have a technical background, but I've worked with technical people all my career in comms and all sorts of things, and many of them would rather stab their own eyes with a pencil than go into a networking breakfast and speak to
Yeah.
people. But having been there, I took a job about too many years ago now, where I was running Vodafone in an interstate location, and they sponsor everything known to man. And I had to go every couple of nights out and speak to people, learn how to network and do it. And it was the last thing on earth I wanted to be doing. I'd come from a corporate sales come technical background, and I learned how to do it. And mind you, the key to it was just ask questions, be interested in
Yeah.
what people have to say. And it occurred to me while you were talking as well that communications skills are really interesting in how to develop those. Not to push our own barrow too much here, but some of the people who are in our audience tonight are students of ours or former students, and we have a subject called MGI 521, Professional Communications, which I think actually addresses some of the things you're alluding to
Mm.
here as well. I don't know whether you ever came across it, but the person that runs it, Brenton, is an absolute expert in this area. He's been a director and an executive in many companies, and I think that sort of preparation really does help in a long-term way as well.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I guess I should say digital directors is there to support members. The goal, it's a social enterprise, right? So the goal is to help digital executives make their way into boardrooms if that's what they choose to do through partners like IT Masters. So a course like that, it's something that we'd recommend and refer people onto if that's something that they want to go seeking. So great opportunity to do that.
I wonder also if there's room in the criteria for, you know, math skills and finance skills and things for people aspiring technical CIOs, etc.
Yeah, the AICT covers a lot of that in they have a director's course which covers sort of those five key areas of finance and legal and strategy and risk and governance and so on. And I don't think we're trying to be the AICD. I think if you want those foundational pieces, you can go there. But what does go missing is um, I hear somebody say something like, "Oh, this person was an accountant at a tech firm, so they're technically adept now, right?" And I think, well, definitely not. If if I was a tech person working in a legal firm, doesn't make me a lawyer, right? There is specifics of the depth of knowledge and the depth of experience and the different way of thinking that comes with a career in digital technology. that just can't be replicated by a 1 hour course or even a day long course by the AICD. So there's definitely a place for understanding the deep digital elements that relate to finance and so on, as you say, that I think that we will be putting a course together to provide. So yeah.
Yes. Sean asks as well. Sorry, have you reached the end?
Have I reached the end? Yes, I have. Yeah, yeah.
Because
I'd just
I
say
happen to know it's the last slide.
no, no. Yeah, exactly. I guess I just say it's a unique chance to for digital directors to disrupt this orthodoxy and enhance their careers and kind of lead Australia's future prosperity. It's a nice mission to be a part of. So I just encourage everybody to be part of the journey. And yeah, happy to take questions.
Sean was asking, and there's a name I recognize from a number of our short courses. What complementary skills do you think are the most valuable for an aspiring digital director?
Yeah, so I touched on some of those earlier. I think if you're able to find experience at that governance level where you are being exposed to those core skills of risk management. So that's a very key one. Risk control, risk management at a governance level. Strategy as well, strategy building. That's not just IT strategy, that's organizational strategy and how IT plugs into that. The regulatory and legislative and compliance type work. So I've had exposure to that through compliance for health systems, for example, where there are compliance standards to be met and so on. But if you're able to come to understand how regulators operate and so on, that's often useful as well. And then there are the broader aspects of governance. So how the organization operates over multiple horizons and so on. And financial is the other one. So a lot of tech leaders will find themselves managing a cost center, right? And if you're able to transfer that, I had somebody just last week say, yeah, techies it's just a cost center. So all you want to do is reduce the cost. That's the only function that they have, right? Is I just want them to make it cheaper, right? And it's that perception is part of what we need to fight because actually techies tech leaders, the CIOs and CISOs and so on are making trade-offs all the time. And actually there's corporate value in that. There's business value in what's being generated, but it's just sometimes difficult to surface that to the perception of the board. So if you're able to bring the value of what you're doing up from, it's a cost center, how can I get the cheapest hardware to this is actually a strategically aligned business value that I'm delivering. That's key as well.
Very much so. You had a Motorola radio on the previous slide, and in a previous life, I also worked with Motorola radios a lot.
Very
And
good.
it was a truism that the service organizations in nearly every servicing organization in the world over made no money. They were a cost center. We turned it
Right.
into a profit center. We flipped the lid on the whole thing and just said, "This is a profit center. This is how you work it." That person that ran that went on to become a director of a company, in
Oh,
fact.
there you go. Yep. That's
And
a great example. Yeah.
yeah, I'm just in the background. I'm going to launch the second poll as well. The first one I just did in the Q&A, just to ask about, where things might go from here. We've obviously been talking for some time, Ben and I, about what we can do to help in this sector, how to educate people, whether there's courses that we can offer. We obviously offer some free short courses. We also do paid courses of various sorts. And maybe there's things out there that will work for people as we go along. So we're just sort of gauging some interest at the moment. So feel free to
Cool.
answer that as you might. I
And
have one
I
more
guess,
question, Ben,
oh
while
yes,
that's
go
going
ahead.
on.
Yeah. Go ahead.
How young should you start? I know that traditionally this is one of those things where people get to, our age-ish
Mm,
and think, you know what, I'd like to retire, but gee, I'd like to work a few days a week. Maybe being a director
mm,
would be a great way to that. Now,
yeah.
that's probably not something you're going to think about in your 20s and 30s.
Mm,
But if you're interested strategically in what the company does from an early age, and most of the people that become directors have that interest, whether they are able to show it in their work or not, how do
mm.
you get into that sort of thing early on so that when the time comes, you're actually armed and ready with a lot of those skills?
Yeah. So I was looking at the AICD survey the other day. The youngest director they polled was 30. Right. So it's not a 20-year-old's game really. There's
No.
and that's fundamentally because of the accountability and that responsibility that comes along with directorship. Um, Usually people want you to have quite an extensive executive career. And actually, reaching the top of your executive career is probably a very good thing to do before you go looking for directorship anyway, because you're going to have had the kind of exposure that you need, and you're going to have built the networks and the background experience that are going to translate into you being an effective director. So there's nothing to stop you, though, early on, as you say, finding something that you're passionate about and volunteering your time to a not-for-profit, right? Not-for-profits are screaming for skilled board directors, particularly the small ones. Not-for-profits turning over less than about $10 million are desperate for skilled professionals to join their boards, and they're particularly desperate for technology on their boards. Some of them are not even thinking about cybersecurity because they're too busy just trying to keep the lights on, right? So if you wanted to make a movement in that direction, I would say find something that you're passionate about or something that's local to your community, and then offer to volunteer your time to support that organization and build your credibility and experience in a board setting. That way, it's kind of a stepping stone towards your final goal. And like I say, it's a long-term commitment directorship. So it's not, send a CV, apply, get a role. You do have to have built that credibility over time. So every time you're volunteering and getting experience in that boardroom, that's adding towards the credibility that's going to eventually get you towards the broader goal that you're seeking.
And by action, it's also networking, whether you think you're
Exactly right.
networking or not.
Yeah, yeah, exactly right.
Okay, I'll give everybody another 5 seconds to see if they want to come up with any
Sure.
questions, but it does seem like people who come to a later session are more prepared. We would encourage you to click on the QR code or the link there.
Yeah.
Take that down. I've also put it in the chat if you would like to join or find out a little bit more about digital directors. We think it's a great initiative and we're very supportive of it because we see for many parts of what we do in educating people in postgrad, and we're speaking to people who are mid-career, so they're starting to think about these sorts of things. It's really the next step, not the final step, but the next stage for many people in their career. And we're excited to be involved in that. Our mission in life is to help educate people from sort of being an intern right up to CISO and board. And the more we can do that, and the better ways we can find to help people, the more happy we are in the end. But thank you very much, Ben, for both sessions tonight and for writing and preparing all of this. I know you said you could do it in your sleep, but it appears that you are actually just able to riff this stuff off the top of your head. And so that would give people who are interested in having a look at the website some confidence that you know what you're talking about as well.
Yeah, feel free to reach out. I'm very responsive on LinkedIn, and I respond to every applicant that joins via the website as well.
Yes, we've had a couple of hundred people. It may not seem like it because of the number of participants here tonight, but we've had a couple of hundred people who are actually interested in this. So I'm hoping that turns into memberships over a period of time.
Yeah,
But
fantastic.
as I said, thank you very much. Thank you all for coming along. I know it's late night for East Coast people, early evening for West Coast people, but a bit of a change because normally we hold sessions at 4 o'clock your time. So thank you very much for coming along. We really appreciate you giving us your time as much as us spending our time. And
Great.
we'll see you at the next session. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Shane. Thanks all.
Bye.